students, and welcome to Year 11 Biology and Module 4 Ecosystem Dynamics. This is video number 12. We're going to have a little bit of a look at some of the small mammals. Our goal is to be able to analyse evidence that present-day organisms have evolved from organisms in the past by examining and interpreting a range of secondary sources to evaluate processes, claims and conclusions relating to the evolution of organisms in Australia, in particular small mammals. Now, this is a very big area for us to cover, and so we're only going to be able to hit a few major points today, but hopefully this will give you a little bit of an idea of the sorts of things that we can look at, the sort of evidence that we can try and collect, and hopefully as a result we'll be able to extend some of our understandings into some different areas. So for those of you who are looking at scaling your success criteria, the basic minimum that you need to be able to do is to describe some changes in small mammal populations in Australia. A next level might be to draw some conclusions about some of the changes that have happened in small mammal populations over time. And ideally, if you can discuss some of the evolutionary pressures on particular species and how that may have led to speciation and change as a result, then you're really getting on to the sort of things that we want you to try and do in order to address this particular area. This is a great book. It's one that I've been reading recently, and I definitely recommend it. But it's written in a very nice style, but it also has a very large amount of information in there, some quite technical, but written in an accessible form about the history and diversity that we see in mammals. Partway through, well into the book actually, on page 317, Brissat writes, "As Australia broke free in the Eocene, it became a laboratory where marsupials could do as they pleased. Many converged on placentals. There are marsupial versions of anteaters, moles, wolves, lions and groundhogs. Others, as we shall see, did their own thing, and certainly some of the marsupials became very specialised for the environments that they found themselves in." So what were the driving forces? What was it about Australia that has given us this very unique fauna and flora, for that matter, and why it's so different to the organisms that we see scattered around the globe? Well, one of the things I think that probably we need to talk about is isolation. And we know that Australia broke away from the larger landmass, the southern landmass of Gondwanan, during the Paleocene or the Eocene. And as a result of that, there's been quite a large amount of evolution that's happened, or change that's happened on the Australian continent, that's happened in isolation. It's a real example of allopatric speciation, where the species was separated from all other ancestral species and then really diversified to fit their particular niches. So it's a really nice example for us when we're looking at trying to understand ecosystems, understanding the particular types of niches and the difference between fundamental and realized niches, and the way that the environmental pressures can actually exert change on populations. So some of the things that we want to consider here are firstly that we had a large number of I guess the country was dominated really by rainforests, by large amounts of rainfall, dominant species of plants that supported a very large population of very large marsupials. And this diversity existed for quite some time. But as Australia drifted north and broke its link with the other continents in Gondwana, probably Antarctica at the most recent, we find that the climate started to change. There's plenty of evidence that suggests that the country was becoming drier and warmer, even as much as 30 to 40 million years ago. There's some suggestions that, particularly for the group that I want to focus on at the end of this video, which is the kangaroos, that the musky rat kangaroo was perhaps one of the forerunners in the macropod group that includes the kangaroos that we'll look at a little bit later. This one seems to have quite a long ancestry and is also one of these species that we're concerned about the recency of its potential endangerment or extinction at the hands of Europeans. Now, human migration was happening as well around the globe, and we're still not sure exactly how early humans reached Australia, the Australian continent. last I see is figures around about the 70,000 years ago mark, but that could be even higher. And we know that there was a period of overlap between human inhabitation of Australia and also things like the megafauna. And we've talked a little bit about megafauna previously, and we will do so again further. We also know that the Indigenous Australians, the First Nations people, were using fire, and their use of fire was very strategic, and it did have an impact on a number of the species that were having to adapt to this changed use of fire in the country. We're also conscious of the fact that some of the changes that have happened to populations in Australia have happened as a result of Europeans arriving in this country over 200 years ago. And so there's been a lot of different factors that have impacted on the fauna, particularly the small mammals in Australia. This is a great phylogenetic tree, and certainly not one that I would expect you to have much familiarity with at this point in time. But this is a great way of trying to represent not only the familial relationships, the ancestors, the common ancestors of different groups of organisms, and we can do this with all sorts of groups, not just the marsupials, but it also tells us a little bit of, it gives us a little bit of an idea about the possible paths of diversity for the very diverse marsupial populations in Australia. You can see, for example, if I identify this little branch here, the Hypsipyramnodon, that's the musky rat kangaroo that we were just talking about recently. And you can see there's a common ancestor between this one and the macropod group. So this is the Macropus, are all of the kangaroos. We've got the petrogales, we've got some wallabies in here, we've got some wallaroos. So we've got a large number of kangaroo-like organisms that are the macropods, the big feet basically, groups that diversified some time in the past, maybe as much as 30 million years ago. But you can also see there's a few other groups down here, a group right down the bottom, closely related, Phascolarctos and Vombatus. Vombatus is probably obvious, and the Phascolarctos is the koala. So these two seem to be quite related to one another, more related to each other than to some of the others in this group. I think one of the most important things about studying phylogeny is how it has changed over time. Obviously, the most obvious thing we had available to us was the actual physical, the morphologies, the appearance of different organisms. And so a lot of the evolutionary relationships or the familial relationships were based on physical similarities between different groups. The advent of DNA sequencing has allowed us to actually look at some specific sequences of DNA and compare them between different groups of organisms, and that's allowed us to identify some relationships that we didn't know existed, and actually to reorganize some of our phylogenetic trees to show some of the relationships between these different types of organisms. Now, while something like a phylogenetic tree is a little bit of fun, it's also a little bit of fun to look at some of the specific small marsupials that we have in this country. And one of the things that's very important for us to consider is the different types of niches that are occupied by so many different types of organisms. Now, there's a whole lot of these different marsupial charts, and it's always nice to get a look at them because sometimes I think we don't appreciate just what a diverse group of organisms the marsupials are. So we certainly have a number of these kangaroo-like organisms, and you can see here kangaroos, wallabies, the pademelon wallabies, the wallaroos, even the tree kangaroos. Tree kangaroos probably a great advertisement for a recent adaptation to an environment. If you've seen tree kangaroos, they just don't look like they belong in trees. But nevertheless, that's where we find them. But we've got these scavengers in terms of the Tasmanian devil. We've got these little hunters, the quolls, or the native cats, if you like. And then we've got some very specialised feeders. So koalas, we're aware, they're very, very specialised for eucalypts. We've got our numbats, which are very specialised anteaters. We've got our honey possums, which are our nectar feeders. There's a whole lot more that we could list on that are not appearing on this particular chart, but nevertheless give you a nice range. And even some of the things like the possums, the brushtail and also the ringtail, two possums that seem to have become quite comfortable living in and around urban areas. So often you find brushtails in particular can be occupying people's roofs, for example. So this is a very diverse group. Some of them are opportunists. They just fill whatever niches are available at the time. And some of them are specialists. So numbats and honey possums have really centered in on a particular diet, and that's the particular niche that they now occupy. The other thing that's interesting when we look at marsupials is the convergence between the sort of shape or the specialized features of some of these organisms and their placental or eutherian counterparts that are found in other parts of the world in similar types of niches. But the one group that we want to just spend a few minutes on at the end of this video is the kangaroo. Now, it probably doesn't qualify as a small marsupial. Certainly the big reds don't. But then I guess if you've got in your mind something like a diprotodon or the giant procoptodon kangaroo, then these probably still do qualify as small marsupials. Now, I think one of the important things about the kangaroos is the number of really specialized adaptations that we see amongst the kangaroos for surviving in their environments. It's been said, I guess, when you study the paleontology of mammals, that one of the things that you're doing very much is studying teeth. Teeth are a very important indicator. The teeth of many organisms, like reptiles, are unspecialized. They have the same types of teeth, the same sort of thing in a lot of sharks or fish, for example. But marsupials have specialized teeth. We've got four basic types of teeth: the incisors, the canines, the premolars, and the molars. And then there's some very specialized shapes, structures, additions to a lot of these different teeth that are an interesting indication of the types of diets that they have. From the massive carnassials of some of the carnivores, the shearing teeth that shear meat, and then you've got some great cuspid molar grinding teeth for a lot of the browsers, and the kangaroos fall into that. But their teeth are even more specialized than that. They have such a wonderful adaptation. When you look in the jaw of a kangaroo, what you will often find is teeth towards the front of the jaw are very worn, very almost flat. But the teeth at the back have the cusps almost looking like they've only just broken through. In some cases, depending on the age of the individual when they died, you can still see brand new molars not quite erupting from the very back of the jaw. This is a process known as sequential eruption, and sequential eruption happens to help renew the teeth that are being destroyed by this very harsh vegetation that the kangaroos have as part of their diet. So these poor quality grasses mean that the kangaroos have got to consume large amounts of them. It really wears their teeth down. So the fact that they can push out teeth at the front that have become virtually worn down to nothing and bring in brand new teeth at the back that have very high prominent molars that can grind plants for them to be able to continue to survive. At some point, of course, if their teeth are all worn down and there are none left to erupt, then a kangaroo can actually die of starvation just because it can't grind up its food anymore. Its classic mode of locomotion is so unique. Watching kangaroos hop around is a pretty common thing for a lot of people who grew up in Australia, but if you didn't, it's a most unusual way to see an animal move around. And yet it's a very efficient way, and the tail has a very important role to play in stabilizing that movement. Kangaroos can hop for very long distances and also very, very quickly. To go hand in hand with that was a reduction in the number of toes, and as the continent was drying out and grasslands were taking over from the heavier, denser forests, the kangaroos were also on the lookout for predators. And so being able to survive in areas where the plants were very low growing, where they were relatively tall themselves, meant they had a lot more warning of any predators that might be on the hunt for kangaroo meat. And one other thing that's worth having a little bit of a look at, which also seems to be a very unique and very interesting feature of kangaroos, is this ability to regulate their reproductive cycles. So the thing about kangaroos is that they were able to have a joey coming back while it's still in the process of weaning, so that it has a particular type of milk that it can feed on as it returns to the pouch. A recent very altricial baby that's born that is very underdeveloped. And when kangaroos are born, the little joeys have a little more than little pink jelly beans, little forelimbs that enable them to crawl up from the vagina into the pouch, where they will attach to a nipple, and they'll then get a particular type of milk that will help them to grow. But the kangaroo can also have another embryo that's growing, that's developing inside of her, which she can pause. If she's experiencing drought conditions, if she's in an environment where the food is scarce, she can actually pause the development of the embryo until times get better. Now, it's possible also for her to be able to expel an embryo. Female kangaroos are very, very good at regulating these cycles, at being able to take advantage of conditions when they are good, but also of conserving their own energy and giving the best opportunity for survival to the offspring that they can by these numbers of different types of adaptations that have occurred over time to this drying, warming continent that they find themselves on. So kangaroos are an absolutely fascinating group, but I think you could do this with pretty much any of the small mammals in Australia. Pick one that you like, go into it in a little bit more detail, and have a look at the ways that these beautiful and very unique organisms are adapted to the Australian environment. Thanks for watching.